Prosometra is a form Prosometra is a form of poetry heavily incorporating prose composition into the work. A form of prosometra is haibun, a Japanese literary form combining haiku and prose. June 30th by American writer Richard Brautigan is a great example of haibun. Well, it's a loose example of haibun poetry, but a great example of prosometra. These 77 poems detail Richard Brautigan's 7-week sojourn in Japan back in 1976. June 30th being the day he departed Japan to return to the States. In the introduction of June 30th, Brautigan writes about the death of his uncle Edward, who was hit with shrapnel in the head during the bombing of Midway. 2 years later, he died as a result of those injuries. Brautigan grew up hating the Japanese for killing his uncle Edward. He was 7 years old at the time of his uncle's death, 5 years old at the time of the bombing of Midway. Brautigan writes here with the shades of Mark Twain. This is in the introduction. He says, I personally killed 352,892 enemy soldiers without wounding one. Children need a lot less hospitals in war than grown-ups do. But by the age of 15, the war had been over for 5 years, and Brautigan's hatred of the Japanese slipped away. In the place of his hatred, Brautigan discovered a love of Japanese poetry, particularly the poets Basho and Issa. During this awakening of his love for Japan, he also studied Zen Buddhism and Japanese painting. At the age of 41, Brautigan set aside his hatred of travel, finally, and visited Japan for the first time. And June 30th was the result of that trip. Brautigan writes primarily from a feeling of otherness. He's a stranger in a strange land. He doesn't speak the language. And he doesn't seem to know very many people. But in addition to his otherness, Brautigan also writes extensively about a feeling of loneliness. And he writes about women and getting drunk and his hotel room on the 30th floor of a high-rise hotel. He writes about mundane things like riding on the bus and writing in cafes, and even about the time he saw his first Japanese fly. Through all this, he muses internally and quietly. And these musings in his quiet moments take the shape of his 7-week haibun diary. At times, it feels like Brautigan's mind is bursting with thoughts and ideas and activity. And at other times, it seems as if Brautigan is trying to practice the Buddhist principle of wu nien, or no thought. Wu nien is the principle that when one is free from defilements, wisdom reveals itself and will not be separated from the essence of mind. Those who understand this Dharma will be free from idle thought. If indeed achieving the meditative state of wu nien, or no thought, on his sojourn in Japan, if that had been his goal, it was obviously unsuccessful. Brautigan often comes across as restless and discursive in June 30th. Yet through this process of, quiet meditation, he does seem to prevent himself from becoming completely frantic. I want to read to you my favorite poem from the bunch, or one of my favorite poems from the bunch. This is On the Elevator Going Down, and it's dated June 4th, 1976 in Tokyo. A Caucasian gets on at the 17th floor. He is old, fat, and expensively dressed. I say hello. I'm friendly. He says hi. Then he looks very carefully at my clothes. I'm not expensively dressed. I think his left shoe costs more than everything I am wearing. He doesn't want to talk to me anymore. I think he is not totally aware that we are really going down, and that there are no clothes after you have been dead for a few thousand years. He thinks, as we silently travel down and get off at the bottom floor, that we are going separate ways. I like that one. Now, June 30th is far from my favorite volume of poetry. It's quaint and frequently amusing, and I've read it 5 times. But it also happens that I'm telling you about it today because today is June 30th. And June 30th also happens to be an important day on my personal calendar. 15 years ago today, I quit smoking, cold turkey, and it was the best thing that I ever did for myself. I also got divorced on the same day, and I like to tell people that I quit 2 bad habits at the same time. But today, my ex-wife and I are very, very close friends. And we actually just celebrated our 15-year divorce anniversary at a concert a couple of days ago. We saw Cat Power, Modest Mouse, and the Pixies, and it was just an absolutely fantastic show. So every year since I quit smoking in 2009, I observe June 30th as my mid-year restitutions, sort of the halfway point between New Year's resolutions. On June 30th, I try to give something back to myself. When I quit smoking, I was reclaiming my health. The next year, I went vegetarian, and that stuck for 4 years. Another year, I quit eating ice cream for a year. I do something different every single year, and it's usually something to give something back either to my health, to my state of mind, and it's not always successful. But because of this, June 30th is a major date on the calendar for me, and I look forward to it every year. And this year, I've set myself up with 2 goals. The first goal is to write a book of prosometric poetry over the course of the next year. Not necessarily daily poetry, but frequently throughout the year, documenting my Woonian pursuit of the elimination of discursive and idle thoughts from my mind. The second goal, and the more probably difficult of the 2, is to stop buying books for an entire year. I have always spent too much money on books, especially books I don't read. Right now, I probably have 1,000 books that I haven't read. The books behind me are just a portion of the books that I own. At least twice as many exist upstairs in my attic. They're just sitting in piles on the floor. This has to stop. So enough is enough. At least for the next year, I'm going to stop collecting books, and I'm going to read stuff that is already in my collection. In fact, I'm going to make the pledge right now that I am going to read at least 100 books from my own shelves before I even consider buying anything else, whether that takes a year or longer. I will allow myself to read library books because I like to read in projects rather than just single books. And so when I read something from one book, it leads me to think about something else. And I don't necessarily have every single book in the world, especially a lot of nonfiction or literary critique. So the library is a great resource for that. I'm also writing a book that requires a lot of research. And right here I've got World War I and the Origins of Military Intelligence. And here I've got the fragments of Proteus, The Main Traveled Roads by Hamlin Garland, and the Deer Watcher's Field Guide. These are all books that I'm using to research for the book that I'm writing. And this isn't stuff that I have in my own collection. So library books are okay, but I will not be buying anything. The library books also don't count as the 100 books that I have to read before I can buy anything else. I have to read 100 books from my own shelf before I buy anything else. So there's that. Happy mid-year restitutions to everyone. Maybe read some poetry today. Maybe write some poetry. High bun poetry is a great place to start. It takes the place of your diary, maybe, because you're writing about yourself. You're writing about your daily goings on. And you can combine prose with your poetic forms. It's simple. It's basically free form. In my mind, it barely actually qualifies as poetry. But the distinctions between prose and poetry is not something I want to get into in this video. That's a pretty complicated subject, and I am not an expert. I do not consider myself a learned poet by any stretch of the imagination. And my friends who are poets would probably object to me trying to draw a line in the sand between what is poetry and what is prose. I'm not going to go there in this video. So, I have been Eric Gronsky. This has been a June 30th video, and until next time, read some Richard Brautigan.